AOC looked the president in the eye on live TV and asked the one question that shattered his immigration narrative and exposed a secret Melania hoped no one would ever say out loud. Nobody expected the room to go that quiet. The town hall in Wichita, Kansas was already tense. The president stood firm at the podium, flanked by flags, rattling off statistics about immigration, border security, and what he called the crisis we can't ignore any longer. AOC sat across from him, face steady, fingers laced, waiting. The moderator turned to her. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, your response?" She didn't hesitate. "If we're going to talk about cracking down on undocumented work, we should be honest. Let's talk about all of it, even the kind that happens in luxury hotels and modeling contracts before someone becomes First Lady." That landed like a brick through glass. Gasps, a few nervous chuckles. Trump froze mid-expression, not quite a frown, not quite a smile. The cameras caught everything. AOC leaned forward. "Mr. President, you've built your platform on going after immigrants, yet you've never addressed the early days of your own wife's time in the U.S. There are public interviews, Mr. President, magazine features where she describes working before getting her visa in order. Is that not, by your standards, illegal?" Trump raised his hand like he was swatting a fly. "That's ridiculous. That's a lie." But the room wasn't buying the denial. Everyone had seen the headlines years ago. They just hadn't heard them spoken aloud like this. Not with this much fire, not with the First Lady's name tied to words like deportation. The moderator blinked, clearly panicking. "Let's, stay focused on policy." "I am focused on policy," AOC said. "That's the whole point. Policies should apply to everyone, or they don't mean anything." Trump's lips curled. "She came here legally. She's a citizen. Are you suggesting we start deporting U.S. citizens now?" "I'm suggesting we hold people to the standards you demand of everyone else," she shot back. "What does it say about our system when a working-class immigrant gets locked in a detention center for a missing paper while the First Lady's history is off limits?" The moderator signaled to cut the segment, but it was too late. The crowd had come alive, not cheering, not booing, just buzzing with the energy of something real, something raw. Phones were already out. Clips were already being tweeted. Trump stepped back from the podium. His mic was still live when he muttered, "She's out of her damn mind." AOC didn't flinch. "That's fine, but I'm not out of facts." Melania hadn't been mentioned by name on live national TV in years. Certainly not like this. The First Lady was rarely seen outside of official portraits and holiday ceremonies. But tonight, her past was front and center. As the cameras cut to commercial, Trump stormed off stage, knocking into a stool on his way out. His team followed, flustered, whispering into earpieces. Someone from the production crew muttered, "That's going to be everywhere by morning." It didn't take that long. By the time AOC's car pulled out from the back of the venue, her phone was lighting up nonstop. Mentions, missed calls. Her chief of staff, Lorna Menendez, stared out the window beside her. "You just kicked a hornet's nest on live television." "I know. He's going to come after you hard." "Let him," AOC said. "I didn't lie." Lorna looked over. "You sure about that? You sure we're clean on this? No gray area?" "There's always gray," AOC said quietly. "But the truth is solid. He knows it. That's why he's pissed." Backstage, the president slammed a water bottle onto the table. "I want statements out tonight. Call Fox. Call the Federal Post. This is a smear job. She's slandering Melania on national television, and I'm not letting that slide." But the footage was already everywhere, on phones, on Reddit, on political TikTok. One clip had been captioned, "AOC just exposed Melania's immigration lie live," and it hit 1 million views in under an hour. The room had been quiet when she first said it, but the country wasn't quiet anymore. But not everyone wanted to wait for the facts. Some were already calling it treason. Others were calling it justice. Air Force One was scheduled to leave Wichita in less than 2 hours, but inside the presidential holding room backstage, everything was chaos. Trump paced, eyes wild, jacket unbuttoned, tie tugged loose at the neck. She crossed a line. I want every goddamn outlet on this. Every one. Two aides stood motionless near the corner, waiting for instructions that kept changing every 5 minutes. She accused Melania on live TV, Trump barked. She accused my wife. And nobody stopped her? Where the hell was the moderator? We're getting statements drafted now, sir, said his comms director, Brixton Feld. He looked about 20 years too young for the job and sweat dripped from his temples. We'll push a rebuttal to the networks before sunrise. We've got Judge Covelli lined up for a segment on Patriot Hour. We're spinning this as character assassination. Trump turned, face red. Character assassination? That makes her the victim. I'm the victim here. We're the ones under attack. You don't spin this, you obliterate her. Make her pay for what she just did. Brixton swallowed hard. Understood, sir. In the corner, a tall, silent figure had just entered. Melania. She wore a navy blue coat, hair pulled back. Her face was unreadable. Trump noticed her and immediately dropped his voice. Hey baby, you okay? She stared at him for a beat too long. Why did she say that about me? Trump stepped closer, voice softer. She's grandstanding, trying to make headlines. Melania didn't blink. But why me? He hesitated just a second. Because she knows it'll get attention. Melania looked over at the screen replaying the town hall moment. Her own face wasn't on it, but her name was. She was quoting an old interview. From before, she said calmly. Trump nodded quickly. It doesn't mean anything. It's old. You're a citizen now. Nobody cares about what happened 25 years ago. But they will now. Outside the room, agents walked the halls with stiff posture. Reporters were already gathering by the metal barricades, trying to catch a glimpse. Inside, Melania's voice was steady. I never lied. I just didn't correct the stories people printed. Trump exhaled through his nose. It doesn't matter. You're First Lady. You're protected. Not from her, Melania said, eyes narrowing. There was something different in her tone. Not fear, just exhaustion. A long sigh that had been building for years. Meanwhile, in the digital world, everything had already exploded. Trending topics included AOCVs, Trump, deport Melania, Melania files, Followgate clips were being slowed down, analyzed, clipped, recaptioned, and thrown across every platform. In Los Angeles, talk show host Chaz Dillard paused mid-interview to replay the moment. Yo, that was not a jab, that was a nuclear shot. She dragged the First Lady into immigration law like it was a courtroom cross-exam. Back in D.C., AOC's team worked past midnight. The office smelled like burnt coffee and stress. Lorna had her laptop open with 4 windows running, C-SPAN, Twitter, CNN, and a shared Google Doc for a press statement. 58,000 DMs and climbing, she muttered, mostly support, but also some death threats. AOC, in leggings and a hoodie, sat on the couch with her shoes off. Any calls from other reps? 3. 2 told you to stay strong. 1 said, you better have your facts straight. I do. You better, because the First Lady's lawyers are going to be watching everything from this point on. AOC didn't speak for a moment. Then, they've had 20 years to correct the narrative. She could have said something. She didn't. That silence let people believe something that wasn't true. That's the real problem. Back on Air Force One, the lights were dimmed, but nobody was sleeping. Melania sat alone, wrapped in a blanket near the back. She stared out the window at nothing. 2 aides passed nearby and lowered their voices, but she heard them anyway. Does she have dual citizenship now? I think just U.S., but no one's really sure how it was processed. Melania closed her eyes. In the forward cabin, Trump sat with his phone in hand, tweeting furiously. AOC is a disgrace to this country. Her false attacks on the First Lady are disgusting and borderline treasonous. Sad. Melania is the most elegant, legal, and accomplished First Lady in American history. Shame on AOC. Shame. But replies weren't what they used to be. Once solid supporters were split. Some were pushing back. If Melania didn't break the law, why so defensive? What if it had been a Latina woman working under the table back then? You'd want her deported. A line had been crossed and no one could step back over it now. But the internet wasn't done digging, and soon Melania's past would become more than just headlines. By 3 a.m., the hashtag #MelaniaVisa had overtaken every trending list in the country. Old news articles that had once gathered digital dust were now front and center, screenshot, annotated, and dissected by everyone from high school debate kids to immigration lawyers on TikTok. A 1996 photo shoot resurfaced where Melania posed in Manhattan, allegedly during a time when she held only a tourist visa. On Reddit, a thread titled "Melania Trump Illegal Worker or Political Scapegoat" was climbing fast, filled with archived interviews, modeling agency leaks, and old quotes from Trump himself. "She was here on a tourist visa when we met. That's how it started." One user commented, "So if she wasn't supposed to be working but she was getting paid, isn't that exactly what they deport others for?" People weren't letting it go. Not this time. A clip of a 2016 morning show interview surfaced where Melania had said, "I followed the rules. I did everything legally." But now those words were being pulled apart by immigration law students live on YouTube. In a small apartment in Bakersfield, California, 31-year-old Karima Jaoudi, an Algerian-born paralegal, sat in her kitchen with her laptop open and a green tea growing cold beside her. She stared at a digital copy of Form Y-129. They would have denied this if she was caught working while holding a B-1, B-2 visa, she whispered to herself, shaking her head. Karima had seen too many lives torn apart by small technicalities. Clients deported for attending one wrong meeting, showing up at a job site too early, or taking cash under the table for a weekend gig. No mercy, no second chances. "But this," she murmured, "this was ignored because of who she married." She opened her camera. "Hi guys, Karima here, quick late-night immigration rundown. If what AOC said is true and it lines up with the timeline, then yes, Melania could have violated immigration laws when she worked as a model before getting her H-1B visa. I'm going to walk you through why that matters." Within minutes, Karima's video started picking up speed. Other experts stitched it. A few challenged her. Most agreed. The question wasn't just whether Melania had done something wrong. It was whether the system had ever cared to notice. Meanwhile, the White House had gone silent. No new tweets, no new press statements. Trump's communications team was holding their breath, watching the story spin further out of their hands. Conservative media scrambled to shift the narrative. On radio stations across the country, hosts tried to redirect the outrage. "She's attacking his family. That's the kind of low these radicals stoop to. She's opening a can of worms that should have been left alone." But the problem was, nobody could prove AOC had lied. In Toledo, Ohio, a retired immigration officer named Jonathan Friel watched CNN with his arms crossed. "Back then, we saw this all the time," he told his wife, who stood beside him drying dishes. European models would come in on tourist visas. They weren't supposed to work, but agencies paid them cash or funneled it through sketchy books. Half of them slid by. "You think she did that?" his wife asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. "She probably didn't think twice about it, but yeah, it sounds like she did." That's what made it different. This wasn't some conspiracy theory pulled from a fringe blog. The facts, once scattered, were lining up. And the more people looked, the clearer the double standard became. At a breakfast joint in Boise, Idaho, two women chatted over coffee the next morning. "I saw AOC trending last night," one of them said. "She was going after Melania." "Good," said the other. "If they're going to throw out people over paperwork, then the Trumps better be held to the same rules." Still, not everyone saw it that way. Right-wing influencers cried foul. Protesters were already gathering outside AOC's district office in the Bronx, even though she wasn't there. Signs read, "Hands off the First Lady. AOC hates America. Deport this." Inside AOC's temporary office in St. Paul, Minnesota, Lorna was flipping through email threads while CNN buzzed in the background. AOC sat beside her, quietly scrolling on her phone. "Have you seen this immigration lawyer from Bakersfield?" Lorna asked. "She basically confirmed everything you said, word for word." "I saw it," AOC replied, still scrolling. "So did Trump. That's why they've gone quiet." Lorna looked up. "How do you know?" "Because silence from Trump means he's waiting, watching, planning his next strike." But before he could respond, the one voice America hadn't heard from yet was about to speak, and that voice belonged to Melania. The day after the town hall felt like a lifetime. AOC woke up in a spare guest room in St. Paul, barely 4 hours of sleep behind her, the blue light from her phone casting faint shadows on the walls. Her inbox was flooded. Texts from fellow Congress members, journalists, even a message from her abuela's old neighbor back in the Bronx. "Mija, I'm proud of you, but please be careful." Downstairs, the rented campaign office smelled like dry bagels and burnt-out nerves. Lorna stood with a mug of coffee, flipping through a thick stack of printed emails. "You got 27 media requests before sunrise, 6 from international outlets. CNN's pushing for a sit-down by this afternoon." AOC looked up from her phone. "Not yet." Lorna raised an eyebrow. "Not yet or not happening? I want them chasing the story, not me." She sat down at the folding table, pulled her laptop over, and typed something into a search bar. Melania's 2001 green card application. A copy of the original model agency press release from 96. Another article from 2000 that described her as having worked under the radar before securing her legal status. The pieces were all there, just like she'd remembered. Lorna leaned against the wall. "You know, I've worked with you through riots, hearings, death threats, fake X scandals. This one still scares me the most." "Why?" AOC asked, still typing. "Because you didn't just go after him. You went after the one person he actually protects, the one thing he doesn't use as a weapon. You made it personal." AOC closed the laptop gently. "It's always been personal. For every immigrant who got locked in a detention facility while their kid cried on the other side of a chain-link fence. For every woman who came here with a dream and got told she wasn't the right kind of immigrant." She paused. Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled slightly. "I'm tired of pretending they get to define who belongs here and who doesn't. Melania is a symbol now, and she knows it." Lorna didn't speak for a moment. Then, "Do you think Melania's going to come out and talk?" "I think she has to." Back in Washington, the First Lady was nowhere to be found. Her staff issued a short statement. "The First Lady remains focused on her role and her family. She will not participate in politically motivated attacks." But the silence wasn't helping. If anything, it made things worse. That afternoon, at a small bookstore cafe in Columbus, Ohio, a young woman named Emilia Florencio gave an impromptu interview for a local paper. She was undocumented. She'd been in the country since she was 9. "I got detained last year for using an expired work permit," Emilia said, nervously clutching a cup of lukewarm chai. "They kept me at that facility for 4 days before letting me out. My aunt had to borrow money for a lawyer, and I read that Melania got a green card for extraordinary ability? Just because she did modeling? Like, is that what makes you legal now?" Her words got picked up and reposted across X, formerly Twitter. Within hours, Emilia's clip had 700,000 views. Her story hit hard. People weren't just talking about AOC versus Trump anymore. They were talking about fairness. That night, AOC sat alone in the quiet office after the team went home. She scrolled through messages, some angry, some grateful, some just confused. Then her phone rang. A New Jersey number. She answered. "This is Alexandria." The voice on the other end was low, careful. "Congresswoman, this is Dr. Emery Kloss. I'm a former USCIS processing officer. I used to handle EB-1 green card reviews, the one Melania Trump received." AOC sat up. "Why are you calling me?" "Because your instincts are correct. That green card should have never been approved under the standards we used. But when someone has high-level legal backing and media presence, the rules bend. Can you go on record? A long pause. Not yet, but I'm working on it. She leaned back slowly. Thank you. Let me know when you're ready. She hung up, heart pounding. Truth was starting to surface in quiet corners. It wasn't loud yet, but it was real. But while AOC was bracing for what came next, someone else was reaching her breaking point. And she wasn't in a campaign office. She was in the East Wing. Inside the White House, it was colder than usual, not in temperature, but in tone. Staff moved slower. Conversations were short, clipped. No one wanted to mention it, but everyone knew. Melania hadn't been seen outside her quarters in over a day. Her phone was off. Her press secretary was scrambling to manage the silence without actually saying anything. In the East Wing, behind closed doors, Melania sat at a long table, her posture perfect, her eyes fixed on an old stack of manila folders. The same folders she'd kept stored away since 2017. Documents, visas, contracts, dates. Her longtime friend and aide, Iveta Krechikova, stood across from her, arms folded. You know you can still say nothing, Iveta said softly. They'll move on. They always do. Melania didn't look up. This time they won't. Iveta sighed. If you speak, you can't take it back. Every word you say will be used, spun, mocked. I know. She opened one folder and pulled out a photocopy of an old modeling contract from 1996. The agency's address was faded. Her listed visa status, tourist, B1, B2. That job paid me $10,000, she said flatly. It was cash, under the table. Iveta looked stunned. You remember the exact amount? Of course I do. They were quiet for a moment. I didn't lie, Melania said finally, but I didn't tell the full truth either. I let people believe what made them comfortable. Iveta pulled out a chair and sat. What do you want to do now? I want to write something. My words, not his. Back in the West Wing, Trump was sitting with his advisors in the Roosevelt room. His attention wasn't on the briefing materials. They were on his phone. News alerts, headlines, WAs, reaction videos, call logs. Every screen seemed to repeat the same narrative. Was Melania Trump ever legal? Brixton Feld stepped in, phone in hand. Sir, she's drafting a statement from her own desk. Trump looked up, instantly annoyed. She doesn't need to say anything. I already defended her. She's doing it anyway. I think she's writing it now. He stood up, face flushed. No. We have messaging protocols. We don't just let people go rogue in this house. She said she's not interested in messaging, Brixton said carefully. She said she wants to talk to the people. Trump stared at him like he'd lost his mind. In her room, Melania pulled a notepad closer. The words came slowly, but they came. She scratched out the first few lines 3 times before settling on the 4th. I came to this country with hope, not a plan. I made mistakes. I took jobs I shouldn't have taken, but I wanted to survive. I did what many women in my position have done, quietly, because we didn't feel allowed to speak. She paused. Her hand trembled slightly as she continued. Being married to a powerful man doesn't erase your past. It doesn't rewrite the rules, but the silence around my story helped protect me while others like me were punished. Iveta leaned over, her voice low. You realize what you're saying could damage everything. You're admitting to something millions have been deported for. Melania didn't stop writing. Exactly. It wasn't a confession. It was a reckoning. 2 hours later, the press secretary released the statement. No announcement, no pre-spin, just a PDF posted on the official First Lady page. The media didn't know what to do with it. CNN went live with breaking news. MSNBC held a full segment. Fox hesitated, then cautiously criticized the tone of the letter without quoting it directly. But people were reading it, really reading it, and they didn't expect what they found. She just admitted to working illegally before getting her papers, said one commentator on a local station in Tucson, Arizona. That's not denial. That's not spin. That's honesty. Brutal honesty. Twitter went into freefall. The hashtags changed. #Melania speaks, #equal rules, #model truth. In AOC's office, Lorna sat beside her, phone open. "Did you read this?" AOC took the phone, scanned the statement, and looked up. She just flipped the script. She didn't deny it, she admitted everything. AOC sat back, rubbing her temple. "That's not what I expected. But maybe it's what the country needed to hear." But for Trump, it wasn't a bold confession. It was betrayal. And he was about to let the world know exactly how he felt. The day after Melania's letter dropped, Washington wasn't just stunned, it was scrambling. Across newsrooms, law offices, and think tanks, everyone had the same question: what happens now? In a glass-walled law firm in Madison, Wisconsin, immigration attorney Saul Moreno walked into a midday panel with local reporters already rolling their cameras. "I'm going to say what most people in my field are thinking," he said, straightening his sleeves. If Melania Trump was anyone else, any other immigrant, especially from the global South, she would have been deported. No trial, no warning, no leniency. "Are you saying she broke the law?" one reporter asked. She admitted it. Working on a B1, B2 visa is a violation. There's no gray area on that. The only difference is how the law was, or wasn't, applied. Moreno wasn't the only one going public. By late afternoon, 4 more immigration attorneys had appeared on national broadcasts echoing the same sentiment. The law exists, but enforcement depends on money, status, and connections. One even pulled out a 1996 statute during a CNN interview. This exact clause has been used to deport thousands of working immigrants who were trying to survive. But in Melania's case, it's been swept under a rug for 2 decades. Suddenly, the debate wasn't about AOC anymore. It wasn't even about Melania. It was about the system. In Birmingham, Alabama, a group of local organizers gathered outside the courthouse. Most were immigrants or the children of immigrants. Handwritten signs read, "One rule for her, one rule for us. We did time for what she gotta pass on. Tell me again about law and order." At the same time, Trump was boiling behind closed doors in the White House. "She made me look like a damn fool," he said, slamming a stack of newspapers onto the dining room table. "After everything I've done, everything I gave her, she goes and admits it?" His inner circle was fractured. Some aides, stunned by Melania's honesty, were calling for damage control. Others advised going after AOC harder, making the conversation about her, not the First Lady. "She knew what she was doing," Trump barked. "She's trying to paint Melania as some kind of victim. I won't let her." In the background, Brixton watched the news scroll by. A chyron read, "Public trust questioned, how the law applies to power." The narrative was slipping. Meanwhile, in San Jose, California, a former ICE translator named Yamileth Navarez uploaded a 7-minute video sharing her experience. "I saw women with babies get deported for using a cousin's social security number to clean hotel rooms," she said. "Those women didn't get to write letters. They got thrown on a plane." Her voice cracked near the end. "And I don't blame Melania for surviving. I blame the system that punishes survival unless you're married to wealth." The video went viral before dinner time. In a quiet corner of Detroit, AOC sat for an interview with a small independent media outlet. No big crew, no flashy setup, just a folding chair, a mic, and the truth. "This isn't about shaming a woman," she said. "This is about exposing the structure that allows 2 people to commit the same action, and only one pays the price." The interviewer asked, "Do you regret bringing it up on live television?" AOC didn't blink. "No, I regret that it took this long for someone to say it." A pause. "I know what it's like to grow up watching people disappear. Friends whose moms got deported over paperwork. A father who worked construction for years under the table, never knowing if today would be the day he didn't come home. That's the world I come from. And it's the world too many people still live in." Her voice didn't rise, but the words hit hard. The First Lady's honesty? I respect it, but her story should never have been hidden to begin with. That silence, her silence, gave cover to a system that destroys lives in the dark. Elsewhere, the DOJ released a short, ambiguous statement. No current legal action is being considered at this time in relation to the First Lady's past immigration history. To some, it sounded like closure. To others, it sounded like protection. The country was divided. But more people were talking, sharing, connecting. And for the first time in a long while, the immigration conversation wasn't being led by fear, but by facts. But not everyone welcomed the shift, and in the shadows of political power, someone was ready to strike back with everything they had. It started with a file, anonymous, untraceable, dropped into the inbox of 3 journalists within minutes of each other. The file was titled AOC Truth Classified. Inside, an old ethics complaint from a former staffer, long ago dismissed but full of vague, dramatic claims. Nothing proven, nothing illegal, but just inflammatory enough to spark outrage if spun the right way. By noon, conservative outlets had already latched on. She attacks the First Lady while hiding skeletons of her own, barked a host on a nationally syndicated AM radio show. Pot, meet kettle. Trump reshared the coverage within minutes, posting, AOC is a hypocrite and a disgrace. People forget she's under investigation. 2, fake news covers for her. Of course it wasn't true. She wasn't under investigation. The complaint had been thrown out 2 years ago without a hearing. But the damage wasn't in the facts. It was in the doubt. In a quiet meeting room in Phoenix, AOC's team gathered around a table, silent, as Lorna read the contents aloud. This is deliberate, Lorna muttered, scrolling. They're trying to drag your name through the mud while the media's focused on Melania. It won't work, AOC said calmly, but her foot tapped under the table. They're not playing by rules, said Deshawn, one of her regional advisors. This is scorched earth. They're going to try and bury you under a mountain of noise. She nodded slow. Then we get louder with the truth. That afternoon, AOC held a press conference. No podium, no grand stage, just her and a crowd of reporters outside the Minnesota state capitol. I stand by everything I said, she began. I told the truth, and when you tell the truth in this country, especially as a woman of color, especially as someone who didn't come from a dynasty, you're going to be attacked. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. What we're seeing now is the desperate response of those who can't defend the facts. So instead, they go after the messenger. Reporters shouted questions, but she didn't stay long, just long enough to say what needed to be said and remind everyone that this was far from over. Back in D.C., Trump fumed at the coverage. She's flipping this around, turning it into a victim story. His new communications advisor, Ryland Sharp, tried to calm him. We need to pivot to jobs, the economy, something normal. Trump shook his head. No more normal. She called out my wife on television. She humiliated me. I want dirt. I want fire. I want her finished. That same evening, AOC's office received 3 death threats. One referenced the town hall directly. Another included her home address, leaked from somewhere internal. Lorna locked the door, eyes scanning the hallway. Security's already on it, she said quickly. They're running background checks, increasing patrols, screening every delivery. AOC nodded, expression unreadable. We knew this might happen. Doesn't mean it should, Lorna said quietly. The next morning, the Washington Beacon published a story citing an unnamed White House staffer claiming AOC had conspired with anti-American groups to attack the First Lady's legacy. The quotes were vague, the sources non-existent, but the headline was all that mattered. AOC linked to radical smear campaign against First Lady. Across forums and right-wing Telegram groups, the tone shifted darker. She's trying to bring down the country. Remove her before she removes us to deport her. In Lincoln, Nebraska, a public school teacher named Joanna Ruzek turned off her TV mid-broadcast, her face pale. They're trying to get her killed, she whispered. Her teenage son, seated nearby with a laptop, looked up. But she's telling the truth. I know, Joanna said, and that's what scares them. Meanwhile, Melania had disappeared from public view again. No events, no statements, just a single post on her private Instagram, a black and white photo of the Statue of Liberty captioned simply, "We all arrive with hope, some are punished for it." It was poetic but vague. Still, it hit a nerve. Within hours, the comments were split between admiration and venom. You knew what you were doing, now face the heat. Respect for telling the truth. Too little, too late. Back in AOC's office, a package arrived. Inside, a tiny figurine of Lady Justice with the blindfold cut off. No note. Lorna held it up, her face tight. That's not just weird, that's a message. AOC took it, stared at it for a long second, then placed it on her desk. "I won't back down," she said softly. But with threats circling and the White House fanning the flames, the question wasn't if the fire would spread, it was who it would burn next. The protests didn't start all at once. They crept up, small clusters of people outside courthouses, city halls, and local immigration offices. Then, like sparks catching wind, they spread. In Fort Worth, Texas, 50 protesters lined the courthouse steps by noon, holding up signs that read, "No papers, no privilege." What makes her different? Rules for some, not for all. By the end of the week, that 50 turned into 500. Meanwhile, in Trenton, New Jersey, a local community center held an impromptu town meeting. Families packed into folding chairs, standing room only, speaking into a single shared mic. One after another, people told their stories. There was Julio Vargas, who had been deported in 2009 after working at a roofing company under a false ID, leaving behind 2 young daughters who were U.S. citizens. Then Amina Saleh, whose sister was detained for overstaying a student visa during the pandemic and was still in a private detention facility in Georgia. She came here legally, like Melania, Amina said, voice shaking, but she didn't have a billionaire husband to sponsor her. The crowd murmured, some cried, others stood in silence, arms crossed. Back in Washington, the air felt thicker with tension. AOC had gone quiet publicly, not because she was backing down, but because she was meeting privately with advocacy groups, immigration attorneys, and human rights organizers. In one closed-door session in Sacramento, she sat across from a panel of legal aid workers and community leaders. "I can't fight this alone," she said. "Not when the machine turns against me this fast." "You're not alone," replied Ria Campos, head of an immigrant women's shelter. "You just said what we've been trying to say for decades. You didn't create the double standard, you revealed it." Meanwhile, late-night television was caught between ridicule and reflection. Comedians mocked Trump's outrage and played mashups of his past speeches on immigration next to Melania's modeling photos. But intercut between the jokes were serious segments, panels of experts questioning what it really meant to follow the law in America. On one popular podcast, host Camilla Banks put it bluntly, "If you're deporting a Honduran janitor for cleaning hotel floors without a permit, but you celebrate a Slovenian model for building an empire off that same legal loophole, what kind of system is that?" In Little Rock, Arkansas, a group of high school seniors took things into their own hands. They created a digital archive titled Broken Scales, documenting cases of immigrants punished for technical visa violations. Within days, thousands of stories poured in. Each entry included a photo, a brief description, and a single question. Would this person have been treated like Melania? The answer was almost always no. For some Americans, this was a wake-up call. For others, it felt like an attack. And those on the fence? They were starting to ask questions, ones that made the usual talking points feel hollow. Inside the White House, Trump's team was working overtime to shift the narrative. In a closed-door meeting, Brixton nervously handed the president a memo. "If we pivot back to border security and drug trafficking, we might be able to reset the conversation." Trump stared at him. "You think I care about resetting? I want her silenced." Melania entered the room as he said it. She didn't speak, just watched him. When he turned and saw her, the silence turned awkward. "You're still on this?" she asked, voice low but direct. "She made a mockery of our family, of you." "She told the truth," Melania replied, "and I did too." Trump's lips tightened. "You didn't need to." "She did," Melania said, then walked out. In El Paso, a woman named Maria Torres stood outside a detention facility, holding a poster of her cousin Esteban, who'd been deported after IC found out he was working as a dishwasher with an expired visa. Where was his second chance, she asked reporters. Where was his letter? The camera caught every word. That night, AOC finally posted a short video, just her, in her apartment, no makeup, no lighting. "Some people say I crossed a line. I didn't. I drew one, and I asked why it only applies to the rest of us." She paused, looked straight at the camera. "I didn't expect the First Lady to admit the truth, but I respect her for doing it. What I can't respect is a country that punishes survival for some and rewards it for others." But as both sides hardened and the spotlight widened, someone unexpected was about to speak, and their words would shift everything again. It wasn't scheduled, it wasn't polished, it wasn't even promoted. But when former First Lady Laura Bush appeared on a nationally syndicated morning show out of Des Moines, Iowa, sipping coffee across from host Ellen Kershaw, everything changed. She was there to talk about literacy programs. But midway through the segment, Ellen leaned in and asked gently, "Mrs. Bush, have you been following the news around Melania Trump and Representative Ocasio-Cortez?" Laura's eyes softened. She placed her cup down and nodded. "Yes, I've been watching, and I've been thinking a lot about it." Ellen tilted her head. "Do you think it's fair for someone to bring up the First Lady's immigration history?" Laura didn't rush her answer. "I think fairness isn't always about comfort. Sometimes it's about courage, and sometimes telling the truth makes people uncomfortable, especially when it challenges what we think we know." That line spread like wildfire. By lunchtime, a clip of her comments had made its way onto nearly every major outlet. She didn't condemn AOC. She didn't defend Melania. She simply made it clear. Truth mattered, even if it hurt. But the real shock came hours later when Melania herself stepped out of the East Wing for the first time since her letter. No cameras, no press, just her and a simple walk across the South Lawn, heading toward a small, closed-door immigration panel at the National Museum of American History. The event had been quietly added to the schedule, and the room was mostly filled with students, local organizers, and museum staff. But when Melania entered, silence fell. She took the stage, looked across the crowd, and began. "I was afraid to speak because I knew what I did. I knew what it would sound like," she said softly. "But now I understand that silence was worse." No one interrupted. "I came here young, eager, and uncertain. I wanted to belong, and in that process I broke rules. I didn't understand the full consequences then. I do now." A woman in the back wiped her eyes. A man in the front leaned forward, almost not breathing. "I don't ask for forgiveness," Melania said, "but I ask that we think about why the same rules are used as weapons against some and not others." She paused, then added, "And I thank the Congresswoman for reminding the country of that truth." Gasps, audible ones. It was the first time anyone in the Trump orbit had publicly acknowledged AOC in anything other than contempt. And it wasn't framed as an attack, it was an acknowledgement, maybe even respect. AOC's phone rang within minutes. Lorna looked down at the screen. "You're trending again, this time with her." On TV, panelists tripped over themselves trying to react. "This is surreal," said one MSNBC analyst. "We now have Melania essentially validating the very thing that ignited this firestorm. That's not small." In Fresno, California, a classroom of 10th graders watched the replay during civics class. Their teacher paused the video. "Let's talk," she said. What do you think this means for how we view power and fairness? One girl in the back raised her hand. It means anyone can be held accountable, even if they're rich. But also, even if they're rich, they might still feel what we feel. In Louisville, a former ICE officer wrote an anonymous op-ed for a mid-tier blog. He wrote, "We knew who got leniency. We were trained to spot red flags, but we also learned who to ignore. Blonde, white, English-speaking models were never the problem. We let them through. I can't pretend anymore." The cracks were widening, and not just in the political walls, but in the personal ones. Trump, meanwhile, was livid. "She's done," he shouted in a closed-door briefing. "You don't thank the enemy. You don't lift her up." He turned to his staff. "She embarrassed me, on my watch, in my house." But even the people in the room were starting to shift in posture. Nobody wanted to say it, but they felt it. Something was different. Back at her apartment, AOC sat quietly. The noise was deafening outside. News choppers, chants from nearby demonstrations, but inside, it was still. She stared at her phone, reading and rereading Melania's final line. "I thank the Congresswoman." AOC set the phone down, closed her eyes. For the first time in days, she let herself exhale. But even with the tension breaking, the consequences of truth had already taken root, and the real change was just beginning. 2 weeks later, the country had moved on, sort of. Cable news cycled to other stories. Midterms loomed. A hurricane formed in the Gulf, but something had shifted underneath all of it. Quietly, permanently. Immigration activists were now getting phone calls from reporters who used to ignore them. Congressional offices, both left and center, were asking for briefings on historical visa policies. And most surprisingly, a bipartisan bill called the Equitable Status Review Act had been introduced by a Republican from Spokane, Washington, and co-sponsored by AOC. The bill wasn't radical. It didn't change the entire system overnight. But it called for a retroactive review process for low-priority immigration violations, especially those related to outdated visa classifications and first-time offenses. A tiny crack in a tightly sealed wall. At a press conference, AOC stood beside her unlikely ally, Representative Carlin Vesey. "This isn't about Melania," she said plainly. "This is about everyone who didn't have a camera in the room when they were asked to explain why they broke a rule to survive." She wasn't smiling. She looked tired, but steady. In Mobile, Alabama, a man named Wilmer Becerra watched that clip from a gas station parking lot. His cousin had been deported 3 years ago for overstaying a student visa by 6 months. He shook his head. "A little too late for us," he said to his wife. But then he added, "Still, I didn't think anyone up there gave a damn." Across the country, others said the same. In Eugene, Oregon, a retired judge sent a letter to the editor of her local paper. "I sentenced 2 immigrants for false paperwork violations in 2008. Today, I wouldn't do the same, because now I know that truth depends on who's allowed to speak it." Even Trump's base seemed less united. He continued to fire shots on Truth Social, calling AOC a left-wing maniac and accusing his own wife of weakness, though those posts were quickly deleted after backlash. Melania, for her part, remained silent. No new statements, no interviews, but she'd been spotted visiting a shelter for immigrant families in San Bernardino, California. No press, no security detail, just quiet observation. A staffer there posted about it anonymously. She didn't speak to cameras, she just asked what they needed. It wasn't performative, it was odd, honestly, but real. In private, AOC wrote in her journal, something she rarely had time to do anymore. "Sometimes you don't speak to change a mind. Sometimes you speak to reveal it." Melania revealed more than I expected, and in doing that, so did the country. Lorna entered the room without knocking. "They're ready for you." "Media?" "No, the group from El Paso, 5 families. They're downstairs." AOC stood and slipped her phone into her pocket. "Good." She walked down the hall of the community center, heart heavier than usual. The walls were lined with photos, volunteers, rallies, handwritten thank you notes from kids in crayon. The families waited inside, seated in folding chairs. One woman stood when AOC entered and spoke in Spanish. Gracias por decir lo que nadie se atrevía. Thank you for saying what no one dared. AOC smiled, small but genuine. It wasn't just me. After the meeting, she stepped outside for air. The street buzzed in the background. Traffic, voices, real life. She leaned against the railing and looked up at the sky. Clouds moved slowly, like they had nowhere to be. She didn't feel like she'd won anything, but she had told the truth, and someone had listened. Maybe that was enough, or maybe it was just the beginning. She pulled out her phone and opened the Notes app, typed one sentence. It doesn't matter who gets to stay, until we ask why so many are told they can't. Then she closed it, walked back inside. If you're still here, thank you. This wasn't just a story about politics. It was about power, truth, and who gets to speak without being silenced. No matter where you stand, remember this: laws without fairness aren't justice. Silence isn't always peace. And truth, when spoken clearly, can't be ignored forever. If this story moved you, share it. Subscribe for more human stories behind the headlines. Your voice matters too.